Hey everybody, welcome back to Contest Prep University. I'm Joe Klemczewski with Adam Atkinson. In our last episode, we talked about genetic limits, and I had a couple interesting conversations today with clients, Adam, and even one yesterday that I want to tie in that puts this in a little bit of a different light. Instead of just genetic limits, what about genetic potential? And one of the things that framed this in my mind was a client who has trained for a very long time. He's working extremely hard to build his best physique. And because he's not necessarily in exercise science academically, he has some really good questions that I think some of us can overlook. One of them was like, how do I do this? How do I get to that point? If I want to build the best physique possible, how do I know I'm doing the right things? How do I know I'm on track? How do I know I'm maximizing my potential? And how will I know when I get there? And I thought, wow, man, those are such great questions. And so I really had to break things down into two or three levels, and each of those levels had different chronological and mechanistic categories. So it's almost like this entire rubric. So, when talking to somebody who may not have that kind of a scientific background, but they have all of the training, desire, all that motivation to improve and to win in physique sport, um, I do. I think we overlook this. I think we absolutely assume people have more knowledge than they do. So I'm going to explain some of those things, Adam, and then have you jump in to help us fill them out for our viewers in our audience. But I had to say, okay, let's first talk about the entire lifespan of a competitor. As we always say, this is a sport that's measured in years and decades, not in days and weeks. And so I had to go back and show him, here's when I started lifting weights at 11 years old. Here I am now at 55 with all kinds of physique changes related to aging. But I stopped my bodybuilding career on the stage, closer to my upper 30s. And yet I actually still continued to improve physically through strength and so forth into my mid 40s. And so you're talking about a span of 4+ decades there of absolute solid progress. And you can measure that in strength. You can measure that in anthropomorphic measurement. Are my arms bigger? Are my legs bigger? You can do it visually. Obviously, that's what the judges are going to do. They're looking at you, so you can take photos and mark that. And I said, as I go through my entire scope of trying to maximize my genetics through my life, I can see progress on all counts. I can see, my physical improvement, my strength, muscle size, etc. But then he stopped me and he said, yeah, but what about winning? What about the results? Like, I want to win. And I had to remind him that I've, lost many more contests than I've won. And yet I was able to kind of climb that ladder. So I want to get into some of the training and the nutrition and some of the things that I know we can utilize to maximize our genetic potential, but in just that larger perspective of the entire life of a competitor. I'm curious, Adam, how you may describe that to clients or people who are just as inquisitive as mine was.
Yeah, I think when you have someone with genetic potential like that, I've had, one of my classic physique guys won the Arnold, and he won his class, missed the overall by, 1 point, and he was probably the best genetic gifted client I had ever had. Um, but I think he might have had, to his point, a little bit of a weaker mind. We really had to go above and beyond to um, keep the diet on point. And, the genetic potential can be limited by the mental potential. And I actually find, because even like my pro wellness client and even my super heavy, we're working more on the mental side with these athletes. And I think sometimes when someone's gifted with so many things, they tend to kind of lag on the backside of the track because they've been given a lot of gifts. And if no one's on your heels, it's easy to slow down in the race because it's a very hard journey. And I think it comes down to when you maximize that genetic potential with athletes, you find their weak points. And that doesn't just mean muscle groups, that means mental groups. And where do they not thrive? Because usually they've been given so much, there's usually something you can fix. One of my guys with a lot of genetic potential sent me his form checks through WhatsApp. I couldn't believe how horrible mechanically he was lifting. And I couldn't believe how big he was. I was like, holy crap. And then a few things made sense. Well, this is why your arms are huge and your back's not as big as it could be because you're just muscling everything in with your arms. And maybe they cheat on their diet, or maybe diet is getting them lean enough tends to be the hardest thing because they're pretty lean, but maybe not as lean as they could be because they've never really had to diet. And as you climb the ladder, those weaknesses of genetic people who have a lot of genetic potential really expose themselves once they're up against a lot of people like them who maybe have just a little bit more mental capacity than the genetically gifted do.
And I am glad I asked. I was not even prepared to talk about the mental, emotional, or intellectual aspects of genetic potential, but you're exactly right. Um, Man, I was even speaking to a client of mine who's a general population guy in college, just trying to lose weight and improve his physique and health. I have a female competitor I had a discussion with this week about potential. And I want to come back to your point about intellectually and from a drive perspective, making sure you can even facilitate all of the change you want. Because I did kind of bleed that into my conversation with one of my clients on training. But back to just the overall scheme of a life of training. Year after year after year after year, can you maximize your genetic potential? I think training first because we're building muscle, and then as Eric Helms said recently, which I love this phrase, it takes training to grow. It takes training is the stimulus, nutrition is permissive of that progress. You can do all the training in the world, but you need the right nutrition to maximize that. If you know you can eat perfectly and not train, nothing's going to happen, right? So it's the training that does it, the nutrition is permissive. So from the training perspective, because this is a client that I cannot see in the gym every day, I can do video clips like you talked about, uh, but I have to explain it the best I can from just a conceptual perspective. So I first talk about muscle physiology. Here's an entire muscle like your bicep made up of muscle fibers. Each fiber is a muscle cell. Those are broken up into sarcomeres by Z lines. You have the actin, myosin filaments, and blah, blah, blah. When it gets down to muscle force production, you're literally talking about sarcomeres just doing this, whether it's your delt, your glutes, your biceps, your quads, like that's all they do. They just contract. Your central nervous system interfaces through a motor end plate with your muscle tissue, and smaller nerve fibers go to bundles of muscle motor units. And this is what they do. They just contract the entire length of a muscle fiber. You have these sarcomeres individually just pulling together to shorten the muscle. So you have to know then positionally it matters how you do that. If you're talking about your quadricep, I can do a leg extension, I can do a leg press, I can do a squat, and ultimately the goal is I'm just extending the knee in terms of the hip flexors, maybe extending the hip as well, two joint muscle. But where are we producing the force? And are we able to produce the most force possible? For example, like your client, you can do a bicep curl. Let's say you've got a 120-pound barbell, but if I'm doing bent over rows with a 300-pound barbell, I mean, I'm using my back, but I'm also definitely still approximating or flexing the elbow joint. So maybe I'm actually gaining more stimulus for my biceps by doing that row. We got to factor that in. So I'm not going to explain this is not all about kinesiology, but there's that. Then you get into how you're creating the energy demand from anaerobic, aerobic, glycolytic, the different energy systems. And so are you working in a low rep range to facilitate fast twitch muscle fiber, or at the other end of the continuum with slow twitch, or something transitional in between? Why are you choosing rep ranges? How close to failure or perceived exertion are you measuring that? That matters how we're going to create that potential stimulus. And on and on and on. I mean, we can go through every aspect. But then I said to him, you need to maximize that every workout. Is every workout the best you can get? And this is where I brought in your point, Adam. Then you have the mental aspect. Are you really present? Is that mind muscle connection as energetic and focused as it can be? Are you bringing your A game every time, or are you just in between sets flipping through your phone looking at email? Like, are you there? Are you, because you string those workouts together for an off season, for a year, for a decade, all of that matters. And when we're talking about genetic potential, you will measure that in strength, in hypertrophy. Is this muscle group kind of lagging behind? Maybe there is a genetic limit or potential to the length of the muscle, the position of the tendons around the joint, all that makes up our symmetry and our overall look, even skeletal structure. So here was one of my points to him, which we kind of covered last time in genetic limitations. You will just never know that you've hit any genetic limits until you cannot physically, mentally go any farther. Like, I don't know, is it a year? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years where you just stopped seeing progress? I think retrospectively, it's easy for somebody to see, but when you're in the middle of it, you're always searching for that progress. So you will always try something new and you will probably see progress somewhere. It is an interesting pursuit, physique sport and training in general, that for decades you can keep improving, where in a lot of performance sports, you just can't.
Absolutely. I think that sometimes we don't think about facilitating doing reps differently. You know, can we hit a set where we're actually just feeling the contraction better versus how much weight are we lifting? I think we also get really one-sided. You know, it might be a great idea to pre-exhaust your quads in bodybuilding. So then when you squat, it's just not as taxing neurologically. Now, this will usually happen with my more advanced competitors who can squat a lot more weight. But just the pressure on the joints, you really have to divide between strength and hypertrophy. So like a pre-exhaust for the quads is great if you're wanting to grow your quads, but pre-exhaust for the chest might actually be better for your triceps than the actual chest. And I see a lot of guys make this mistake all the time. It's like, well, when your chest is fatigued, what has to take over to press that weight? Now your triceps. So mechanically, how you choose your movements and set up your movements is super important. And I think that that's another way to really maximize all of this. Also, if you really want to find out what intensity and true failure is, just watch a couple Tom Platz videos and you'll really find those, well, I shouldn't say man maker sets, man and woman maker sets, but you will really find how to train intensely. And even I've got my mojo back, and I just remember my Friday workout last week. My wife looked at me and said, "Rack," and I said, "I got like one more, maybe two. Help me." And I knew I was at absolute failure, and because she thought I was at failure when she said rack, and I said that's where I know I'm pushing enough. So you may actually have to fail to find out what failure is. You also have to keep in mind, are you failing due to aerobic fatigue? I see this a lot with my men who don't do any cardio, or are you failing because of true muscular fatigue? You couldn't physically get one more rep because you're in shape and trying to push your hardest.
It's funny. I have literally sent video clips of Tom Platz workouts to clients to express that particular point. But one of the things that I also want to do is tie it back to the academics. And to this client I was discussing this with today, I said, we wouldn't know unless people like Schoenfeld, Krieger, and so forth have done studies proving the value of 20, 30, 50 rep sets because we're talking about taxing the different energy systems, therefore different muscle fiber types in different ways. And in one sense, that kind of research is fantastic because it does create boundaries for, hey, we need to stay here, emphasize this a little bit more. But then think of the person who just wanders into the gym for 20 or 30 years and they figure it out. They know what works for them. Like they've done it all and they see what works and what doesn't. And so just intuitively, they end up in those places like Tom Platz did with, his slow twitch muscle fiber dominance and so forth. But I also, you brought up a huge, huge point, which is being open-minded and trying new things, experimenting, seeking instruction. I'll never forget, I had hired a powerlifting coach, I mean, one of the best in the world, to work with me for an entire year. And as excited as I was to just give somebody else the reins and just trust the process because I want to do something new, it was also very difficult because at times he would suggest things and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you do that? That's stupid. And both limitation wise, I was obviously just scraping against my own preconceived notions and biases, but there are always trade-offs. And so, yes, when you're discussing pre-exhausting this, what does that do for you? It may emphasize this, but then it changes this over here. Some of those things are just great to experiment with. And as I said, your own biases may take you completely a different direction when you could have been achieving something more just by being that open-minded.
Yeah. It, it's really tough because sometimes you need clients to forget what they know. Sometimes what they know is super valuable, even though you're the coach. And it's really kind of depicting between is someone coachable and can you guys actually collaborate together? I almost like the word collaboration versus coaching, or I almost say a bodybuilding caddy versus a coach. We're going to discuss what clubs to use and kind of come on an agreement. Do we need a 6 or a 7 iron, or do we need to swing the 7 iron at like 90%? Because that's going to be what perfect is for us.
I think you're kind of setting yourself up for retirement. You keep bringing in these golf metaphors,
Right.
and so you make that transition. Well, a brief transition over to nutrition, supplementation, some of the ancillary components of making sure you're maximizing your genetic potential. The biggest, of course, is nutrition outside of training. Again, it's permissive. If throughout the off seasons, if you're not, yeah, obviously you're not strict, you're not necessarily, you know, measuring every single gram of macronutrients. At least I hope you're not. But are you getting enough protein? Is it around the clock? Are you cycling it to make sure receptor site degradation isn't occurring? Are there things that you're doing, perhaps in making sure you don't gain too much body fat? Because then in a pre-contest, then you diet away so much of what you've gained because of a longer, harder duration of a diet process. Are you on the other end of the spectrum getting up high enough? Like, are you getting away from your metabolic set point just enough to create that potential year after year after year? Maybe once or twice in your life, are you allowing body fat to drift up a little higher to take a prolonged off season and focus on powerlifting type mechanics, thinking as much about the movement as you are the muscle tissue? These can be important nutrition factors combined with training. On the supplement side, I think you and I will agree, but I'll ask for your input. Like, I mean, we know what creatine does, but is it really any long-term benefit? Is it really doing anything if you've never taken it? Are there other supplements, amino acids, things you take that you think if I had not done this for 20 or 30 years, I would not be as good as I am?
Really think creatine just really, you know, shines the light. That's probably something I have 95% of my clients on. It's interesting because some people think it bloats them, and I think they get a little bit fearful. Those are usually your people, you have to be a little bit more concerned about the scale with or scale changes. And maybe just implement it slowly. You don't always have to do the clinical dose. You can go a little bit lower and see how you feel, but something naturally occurring in the body shouldn't bloat you, or else you'd just be bloated all the time. So that's
Mhm.
usually my argument to that. But I think creatine just stands as a great foundation and one of the most researched supplements, of all time. And that's why I like it so much. There's really no health issues with taking it or any reason why anyone should not take it.
And if it gives you even just 3 to 5% extra muscle gain, force production, hydration in the muscle cells because of it resynthesizing ATP, even all that is just acute mechanistic response. Again, if it allows you to train a little harder, get a couple extra reps, be a little stronger, then that's all added to your muscular frame that wouldn't have been there prior. So it's certainly not like a PED, but it can be something that helps you maximize or accelerate genetic potential. But to close out, I do want to bring up PEDs for a minute because everything we just described is as close to a closed system as you can get. It's all within your normal homeostatic biology. Now let's open the floodgates. Let's triple your testosterone levels. Let's bring in 5 different androgens to pharmacologically obliterate every limit that we have been under in our entire first 20 minutes of this conversation. All of a sudden, progress is almost limitless compared to how much, or in conjunction with how much you want to use, how you use it, and so forth. So it becomes a slippery slope for competitors to say, well, let me just start with a little TRT. Man, that worked. Let me double that dose. Man, maybe I should add a little this, add a little that. Well, what about this plus this? And so we know, you look at the Olympia stage, somebody who is 5'10" and weighs 260 pounds, if they were natural, they may be 80 pounds less. So obviously, this is now a more open system where your limits are moved by yourself at your own hand as to what you're willing to take. You and I don't tell clients, don't take PEDs or take this, take that. Like we just don't give that kind of advice for multiple reasons. But for clients who do, clients who make that decision from a physiological perspective for safety, for stacking the progress as it may maximize potential, do you have a way of adding certain things where you at least give people the information like this is the path you should consider taking?
Yeah, I think that it depends on how the person's responded on drugs in the past. Maybe they're a first time user and everything's progressive, just like your nutrition or training. We're not going to start here when you're a first time user. Some people respond faster than others, of course. But I always like to have the talk of family history, how have a lot of your family members passed away? Um, and a lot of people might say cancer, or if they say heart disease, that's kind of a red flag. But then also if it's cancer, well, at what ages did your family members pass away? Maybe they died at such a young age, you don't really know, like, had they been 60 years old, would they have made it because of the heart? Because if something else is knocking them out, you really don't know the potential of the heart. Maybe they're adopted, maybe they don't know. So I think that, how do the lab markers initially look and how much do they get skewed down the road? I have a client with a clotting disorder, factor V lead-in. I mean, there's there's just no way we're going to do anything that lets estradiol rise up. That's certainly a limiting factor because estrogen's anabolic, and but I'm not going to risk clotting for him to do, something more extreme.
Yeah, and that's a perfect way to end it in that just for those health markers alone, you would want to employ some caution. But the stress to the muscle tissue, tendons, and so forth to take a more sequential chronological path where you're moving the goalpost a little bit at a time because we're talking about maximizing genetic potential. So if you all of a sudden give your body more than you should at that point, you could have systemic endocrinological issues, all kinds of organ system stress, but also the orthopedic, musculoskeletal problems you could incur. And if you just move that genetic potential bar a little bit higher each time, you could probably avoid a lot of serious impending, health catastrophe. And as you said, just kind of take notes and see how you're doing as you go. But I definitely wanted to throw that in there because, again, it's just part of our sport to some degree, and those questions arise as well. That is how you can erase some of those boundaries for genetic limits and expand genetic potential.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think a lot of people, we really don't know what that specific limit is until someone dives in. And I think that's really what ultimately, most of these open men bodybuilders have phenomenal genetics. But at what point do systems start kind of shutting down, or do we have warning shots? And then we also have to consider at that point, how much of your identity is tied up into this where you can hit the brakes, or can you not mentally hit the brakes? Because at that point, you kind of have a psychological addiction to being big.
Absolutely. Another discussion for another day. I appreciate you jumping in with this one, Adam. Great as always. Those of you in our Contest Prep University D1 club, what a great topic to continue offline. So if you guys want to jump in the chat on that when you see this and continue some discussion points there, we'd be happy to help you with your own individual careers and journeys. And Adam, I will see you next time in Contest Prep University along with all of our viewers.